She was born Doris Marianne Kappelhoff on the 3rd of April, 1922, in Evanston, a quiet neighborhood on the western edge of Cincinnati, Ohio, where the streets were lined with modest houses and the summers smelled of cut grass and river heat. Her father was a music teacher and choir director. Her mother a homemaker who worshipped her daughter's easy laugh and the way she could fill a room simply by walking into it. From the very beginning, Doris was the kind of child people noticed, not because she demanded attention, but because something in her seemed to generate warmth the way the sun generates light, naturally, without effort, as though it had simply always been that way. She wanted to be a dancer. From the time she was old enough to cross a room on her own, she had been drawn to movement, to the way the body could speak in rhythms that words never quite managed. By her early teens, she was genuinely gifted, training seriously, performing locally, beginning to imagine a future built around the thing she loved most. In 1937, when she was 15 years old, she was involved in a car accident that shattered her right leg so severely that her doctors told her she would never dance professionally again. She lay in a hospital bed for months, unable to walk, listening to the radio because there was nothing else to do. And it was during those long, immobile afternoons that she began to sing along with the songs she heard, not as a consolation prize, not as a second choice, but because something in the music reached her in a way nothing else could during those months of pain and enforced stillness. Her mother enrolled her in voice lessons. Her voice, it turned out, was extraordinary. By the time she was 17, Doris Kappelhoff had become Doris Day, a stage name borrowed from one of her favorite songs, and she was singing with the Les Brown Band, touring the country in a world that had not yet heard of her, but was about to. Her voice had a quality that was almost impossible to define, something warm and direct and completely unaffected, as though she were singing only to you, as though there were no microphone, no audience, no performance at all, only this woman telling you something true. By the late 1940s, she was one of the most popular recording artists in America. By 1948, she was in Hollywood, cast in Romance on the High Seas, her first film, and the machinery of stardom had begun to build around her, something she had not exactly asked for and would spend the rest of her life living inside. The image they built was this: Doris Day, the girl next door. Sunny, wholesome, optimistic, the embodiment of a certain idea of American womanhood that felt safe and reassuring and uncomplicated. She was the woman audiences wanted to believe existed, the woman for whom things turned out well, for whom the world was fundamentally kind. The studio polished this image until it shone so brightly it was almost impossible to see the person inside it. And the person inside it, as it turned out, had a considerably more complicated relationship with the world than the image ever suggested. Her first marriage, to a musician named Al Jordan, began before her career and ended in a pattern of violence and control that she would not speak of publicly for decades. She was barely 18 when she married him, barely old enough to understand what she was walking into. And what she was walking into was the kind of marriage that leaves marks that do not show. She had a son, Terry, from this marriage, a boy who would grow into one of the most important music producers of the 1960s. a man whose life would eventually become entangled with one of the darkest episodes in American cultural history. When she left Jordan, she married again a saxophonist named George Weidler, and that marriage ended within a year. She was 26 years old, twice divorced, raising a son alone, and simultaneously becoming one of the most recognizable faces in American cinema. The gap between the life and the image was already enormous, and it was only going to grow. The films came quickly, and they came well. Calamity Jane in 1953, in which she played a rough-edged frontier woman hiding her own loneliness under bravado, a role that felt closer to the truth than most people recognized at the time. Pillow Talk in 1959 with Rock Hudson, which made them one of the most beloved comic partnerships in Hollywood history, and which existed, as almost everyone on that set knew, and almost no one said publicly, entirely in the space between what was real and what was performed. Rock Hudson was a man keeping a secret that would one day cost him his life. And Doris Day was a woman keeping secrets of her own. And together, they made films about romantic misunderstandings and comic deceptions that audiences adored precisely because they felt so light and so safe. It was somewhere in these years, in the late 1950s and early 1960s, that her world briefly and almost silently intersected with Audrey Hepburn's. They were not close friends, not the kind of women who lunched together or confided in each other, but they moved through the same world, attended the same events, existed in that strange, compressed geography that Hollywood creates where everyone who matters seems to know everyone else. What they shared, more than any specific friendship, was a certain position. They were both, in different ways, images. Audrey was the European sophisticate, all graceful restraint and Givenchy elegance, the woman who made intelligence and delicacy seem like the highest possible glamour. Doris was the American sunshine, the girl next door elevated to mythology, warmth made visible and safely contained. The studios and the magazines loved to place them in implicit conversation. Two versions of what a woman could be, two different mirrors held up to the same era's desires. What neither image left room for was the truth underneath. Audrey carried the weight of a wartime childhood she spoke of only obliquely, the hunger and fear of occupied Holland, the father who had abandoned her, the longing for stability that shaped every choice she made. Doris carried the weight of marriages that had failed or damaged her, a son she was raising in an industry that barely paused to notice, and an image so persistently cheerful that any darkness in her actual life seemed almost impolite to mention. They were both, in their different ways, performing a version of themselves that the world had decided it needed, and performing it with such skill that the performance had long since swallowed the person. There is a particular kind of loneliness that belongs to women whose public face is their most celebrated quality. It is the loneliness of never being quite sure whether the room lights up because you walked in or because the image of you walked in, whether the warmth people feel in your presence is for you or for the idea of you they have been carrying since the last film or the last interview or the last photograph. Both Doris Day and Audrey Hepburn understood this loneliness from the inside, though they would never have described it in those terms, and never did publicly, because the image required otherwise. In 1951, Doris had married Martin Melcher, a man who was simultaneously her manager and, as it would eventually emerge, her financial executor in the most devastating sense of that phrase. Melcher presented himself as a partner, a protector, someone managing the business of her career so she could focus on the work. For 17 years, she trusted him entirely. She had no reason not to. He handled the contracts, the investments, the decisions about which projects to take and which to decline. Doris Day showed up, performed brilliantly, and assumed that the life being built around her was being built securely. She was wrong in a way that would take years to fully comprehend. When Martin Melcher died in April 1968, Doris Day was left with the accounting. What she discovered, working through the paperwork with her son Terry and a lawyer named Jerome Rosenthal, who would himself eventually be disbarred, was that the fortune she had spent 2 decades building had been systematically mismanaged and in large part lost. 17 years of films, of albums, of touring, of being one of the most bankable stars in Hollywood. And at the end of it, there was not the security she had assumed, but something close to ruin. She was 46 years old. She owed money she did not have. And she had, without knowing it, been signed by her late husband to a television series she had never agreed to, had never even been told about, a commitment that she now had no choice but to honor. The Doris Day Show ran for 5 seasons. She did not want to do it. She had not chosen to do it. She did it because there was no other option, because the debt required income and the income required work, and the work available to her was this. She showed up. She performed. She was, by every account of everyone who worked with her, entirely professional and entirely kind, exactly the person the image had always promised she was. The image, in other words, turned out not to have been entirely false. The warmth was real. The difficulty was also real. She held both as she had always held both, without letting one cancel the other. It was during these years that Audrey Hepburn quietly began her own retreat from the world that had made her famous. The film slowed and eventually stopped. She moved to Switzerland to a house in Tolochenaz called La Paisible, the peaceful place, and she built the private life she had always wanted around her children and her garden and the relative anonymity that European distance from Hollywood afforded. She and Doris had never been intimate friends, but the parallel was there for those who wanted to see it. 2 women who had given the better part of their adult lives to an image, now choosing in their different ways to put the image down and see what was underneath. For Doris, what was underneath was animals. She had always loved them, dogs especially, but also any creature in need of care, in need of someone to notice it was there. As the 1970s progressed and her public profile receded, her commitment to animal welfare deepened from a personal affection into something closer to a calling. She established the Doris Day Animal Foundation. She lobbied. She advocated. She used whatever remained of her celebrity in service of creatures who had no celebrity of their own and needed someone else's. Friends who knew her in these years described a woman who seemed, for the first time in decades, to be living entirely in her own name rather than her images, who had found in the concrete daily work of helping animals something the film sets and the recording studios had never quite given her. the feeling of being exactly where she was supposed to be. There was grief in this period, too. Her son Terry, the boy she had raised alone in the early years, the music producer who had worked with the Byrds and the Beach Boys and who had been, by terrible accident of timing and geography, briefly entangled with Charles Manson's circle before the murders that would define that moment in American history forever. Terry was struggling. He had always struggled in the particular way that the children of famous parents sometimes do, carrying the weight of a name that was not entirely his own while trying to find out who he actually was. His relationship with his mother was complicated, loving, and difficult in the way that mother-son relationships often are, when the mother is also a myth and the son has spent his life in that myth's shadow. He died in 2004 of pneumonia, and Doris lost with him the last direct connection to the earliest and most complicated years of her life. The world, by then, had long since revised its understanding of her. The image of the relentlessly sunny girl next door had given way, gradually and then all at once, to a more honest portrait. A woman of genuine resilience who had survived abuse and financial devastation and public misrepresentation and personal loss, who had shown up consistently for decades to give audiences something they needed even when her own life was in pieces, who had then laid down the performance and chosen something quieter and more her own. Critics who had once dismissed her films as lightweight began to look again and find in them something more interesting than they had initially allowed. A woman whose warmth was not naive but hard-won, who smiled because she had decided to rather than because she had no reason not to. Audrey Hepburn died in January 1993 in her peaceful house in Switzerland, having spent her final years traveling the world for UNICEF with a quiet ferocity of purpose that surprised even people who had admired her for decades. Doris Day outlived her by more than 26 years, dying in May 2019 at the age of 97, in Carmel by the Sea in California, in a house full of dogs, having spent the last decades of her life doing exactly what she wanted to do in exactly the way she wanted to do it. They were, in the end, two different answers to the same question. What do you do when the world decides what you are before you have finished deciding for yourself? Audrey retreated into privacy and found peace and purpose. Doris stayed visible just long enough to pay her debts, then turned toward the creatures who needed her and did not care at all what the image had promised. Neither answer was wrong. Both required more courage than the image had ever suggested either woman possessed. What the image never showed, in either case, was the thing that made them worth remembering. Not the elegance or the sunshine or the Academy Awards or the record sales, but the fact that underneath all of it there were two women doing their best with what they had been given, which included considerable gifts and considerable grief, as is the case with almost everyone, and which they carried with more grace than most. The Cincinnati girl who had wanted to be a dancer and ended up becoming something no one had a word for, something between an icon and a woman, between a performance and a person, between the image the world needed and the self she quietly kept alive underneath it through all the years of marriage and betrayal and debt and loss and work and love and dogs. The girl whose leg was broken and who turned In that stillness toward her voice, the voice that turned out to be the truest thing about her, not the cheerfulness the studios packaged and sold, but the warmth that produced it, which was entirely her own, and which no amount of mismanagement or disappointment or grief ever fully managed to extinguish. Audrey Hepburn would have understood this. She had her own version of it. The wound that became the gift, the loss that pointed toward the calling, the performance sustained long enough to pay the bills and raise the children, and then finally, the quiet and deliberate choosing of what actually mattered. In the long view, the two of them were not so different after all. The European sophisticate and the Cincinnati sunshine, the Givenchy gown and the girl next door. Both of them real women moving through a world that preferred the image. Both of them surviving it with more grace than it deserved. The films remain. Calamity Jane and Pillow Talk and the recordings, all those recordings, that voice pouring out of radios and phonographs and eventually streaming services in a digital age she lived long enough to see, carrying with it a warmth so genuine it still crosses the distance of decades and arrives intact, as warm as when it left. That is the thing about a real voice. It does not age. It simply continues to tell you something true, long after the woman who produced it has found her way to whatever comes next, long after the image has dissolved, and only the truth of it remains. Doris Day did not become the dancer she had planned to be. She became something else entirely, something that required the accident, and the hospital bed, and the radio songs, and all the marriages that broke, and all the money that disappeared, and all the years of showing up anyway, and all the animals she saved, and all the grief she carried without letting it win. She became, in the end, simply herself, which turned out to be more than enough, and which the image, in all its relentless sunshine, had been pointing toward all along without quite knowing how to say so. Every week, one moment from Audrey Hepburn's life. Subscribe so you don't miss the next one.